This is the second episode of our 12-part webinar series on countermeasure strategies for pedestrian safety. Today's presentation is going to focus on road diets. The presentation will be delivered by Matthew Ridgeway. Matthew is a principal with Fair and Piers Transportation Consultants, and we're excited to have him here to deliver the presentation today. My name is Dan Jolene, and I'll be facilitating the webinar today. I'd like to ask the attendees, if you can all hear me, if you can click the hand icon in the upper right-hand corner of your screen to let me know that the audio is coming through. Hopefully, we'll start to see your hands going up, and it looks like you all can hear me, so that's great. Thank you all very much for choosing to spend the afternoon or the morning with us, wherever you are. We're hoping to have a good presentation and discussion today about road diets. Before we get started, I just want to go over a few administrative details about the webinar software. If for some reason during the webinar your computer freezes, please just reload the website and log back in, and you should be able to rejoin the session where you left off. We'll be posting the presentation slides and a recording of the webinar to the PBIC website, so you will be able to look back at anything that you missed. The presentation slides are actually already posted on the webinar page right now, so you can go ahead and look for those. The video recording of the webinar may not be available for another 1 to 2 weeks, so keep checking that site if you want to refer back to the recording of the webinar. Please note that attendees will not be able to speak during the webinar, although you will have the ability to submit questions and comments using the chat function. So please do that. Feel free to send us your comments and questions as we move through, and we'll be able to get to those during the discussion period. We'll be holding about 20 to 30 minutes at the end for a question and answer session. Later today, you're all going to receive a follow-up email from the UNC Highway Safety Research Center that'll include a link to download a certificate of attendance for the webinar. It's important that if you are attending the webinar with multiple attendees and you have a bunch of people in your room who are looking on with you, if you were the one who receives this email, if you were the one who registered, you'll need to pass that link around to the rest of the group to let them use it to generate their certificate of attendance. So please be sure to do that once you get that email this afternoon. The email is also going to contain a link to the website where we posted the presentation materials for today's webinar and the link where we'll be posting the video of the webinar recording once it is available. The webinar has been submitted to the American Planning Association to be considered for 1.5 CM credits. You should check the AICP event calendar online for more information about that. To learn more about PBIC webinars and all of our upcoming sessions, please visit pedbikeinfo.org/webinars. And I have one more slide here with some information about some of our upcoming sessions. You may have attended last week's session, which is the first in this series. You see on the screen here the information about the 3 upcoming webinars after this one. If you haven't already and you're interested in these topics, please go ahead and visit that link there to register for these webinars. We'll be doing, as I mentioned, a total of 12 webinars focusing on different safety countermeasures for pedestrians. So I'd encourage you to attend these if you're interested in learning more about any of these topics. Before we get started with the webinar today, I wanted to take a quick poll of the audience to find out exactly how many people are going to be joining the webinar today. Please take a look at your screen and cast your vote. Let us know if you're attending with, if it's just yourself looking on the webinar, if you've got a group, 2 to 3 people, 3 to 4, or higher. Just let us know about how many people are with you. This helps us track how many people are attending and also how people are viewing our webinars, whether you're doing so in group settings or just individually. I'll just leave this open for a bit, just a few more seconds to cast your vote, and then we'll move on to the presentation today. Okay. All right. Thank you all for voting. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. I appreciate all of your feedback on our poll question. We're going to go ahead and get started with the webinar today. I'm going to turn things over to Matthew Ridgeway, to get started with his presentation. Matthew, you should see an alert come across the screen to accept screen control, and we should then be able to see your screen. Okay, looks good. All right, I can see it. Okay, Matthew,
Great.
you're good to go whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Dan. So as Dan said, my name is Matthew Ridgeway. I'm a principal with Fair & Peers. I've been in the Bay Area offices of Fair & Peers for 21 years, and just in April of this year opened our Washington, D.C. office. So a new entrance to the East Coast, and looking forward to experiences there. I've worked on a number of road diet projects. My first one was back in 1995, a traditional 4-to-3 that had pretty significant safety benefits. I've worked on road diets with volumes of up to 28,000 vehicles per day. I've worked on road diets with pretty heavy bus and truck movements, and I've worked on road diets that are on state routes. So I think I run the gamut in terms of experience with road diets, and that's the topic of the day. Generally, when we talk about road diets, it's any kind of reduction of lane, whether it be just reducing the width of a lane or actually removing the lane and repurposing it. But this presentation really focuses more on the traditional 4-to-3 conversion. Much of the benefit that you get from those is pretty transferable to the 6-to-5 conversion, so that's a little less commonly done, but still much of this presentation will be applicable to that as well. So here's the traditional 4-to-3 conversion, 4-lane undivided on the left, and then 3 lanes with 1 in each direction, and either a 2-way left turn lane or turn pockets, and then repurposing the curb space for either parking or bike lane is sort of the norm of how road diets are done, and they're done pretty widely at this point, and for good reason. The safety characteristics of the 4-lane undivided roadway is one of the poorer in our circulation systems, and the reason for that are illustrated for vehicles in this slide, which indicates that when a vehicle is in the innermost lane and on a 4-lane undivided configuration and wants to turn left, they stop in that lane. And the result is often, or sometimes, that the vehicle who's approaching from behind will rear end that vehicle, so that these types of roadways tend to have a higher incidence of rear end collisions than intersections where you have a separate left turn pocket. The other incidence of collisions for autos that's pretty common is sideswipe, which is a similar scenario. The vehicle in the innermost through lane slows to make a turn, either into a driveway or a side street, and a vehicle who's approaching from behind tries to avoid getting stuck behind that car and changes lanes, and that results in sideswipe collisions. So these are pretty common on the road diet configuration, and you can see how the 3-lane section on the right really does eliminate at least much of the threat that you get from the approaching from behind. And the slide on the right still does show that there's a collision risk for vehicles who are slowing to turn right and with another vehicle approaching from behind. But another thing we'll talk about later in this presentation is that you can also, through road diet, actually provide dedicated right turn lanes. So you can often repurpose at a signalized intersection or the location where you want a right turn pocket. You can actually repurpose the lanes in such a way that what was 4-lane undivided provides a through, a left, and a right on the approach direction, and do that all within the current curb-to-curb width. The other thing about road diets from a vehicle perspective is just that you have fewer conflicts at intersections, so fewer conflict points, in fact, twice as few, half as many as you have in the 3-lane configuration. Before I get too far, I should note that this information, much of the information I'm presenting today, is from the November 2014 FHWA Road Diet Information Guide. So it is a new update, and so if you've seen the older one, I'll be presenting some statistics, especially on collisions, that are pretty different than the prior version. And generally, the new guide has a more robust set of information about design practices and so forth. So I would recommend, if you haven't looked at that, it would be a good thing to get a copy of in your office. Then the other thing about road diets in terms of a safety consideration is just this idea of being able to see how many vehicles are approaching. This is even more a point on the next slide when we talk about pedestrians, but the idea that if you're trying to make a left across 2 lanes, one vehicle may block your view of the other vehicle is an important one, and that is also alleviated with the reduction of lanes from 4 to 3. And then, as I said, from a pedestrian standpoint, and I should note that most of the safety benefits you derive, at least in terms of reducing the number of collisions, are derived for automobiles. They're the ones that most benefit from the introduction of road diets. But pedestrians certainly do benefit as well. And one of them is the reduction of the multiple threats. So just as in the last slide, there was an instance where one vehicle, or the vehicle who's trying to turn left is sort of confronted with two vehicles. In the case of pedestrians, it's even more dire because as you're crossing a street in an uncontrolled crosswalk and assuming that the vehicle is supposed to yield to you, if depending on what state you're in, then if the first vehicle yields to you, then oftentimes it sets up a scenario where the second vehicle can't see through the first vehicle to see the pedestrian in the crosswalk, and so we'll pass the vehicle. And unfortunately, this often results in a fairly high-speed collision, so the risk of fatality is higher than in a typical pedestrian-to-vehicle collision. So it is one of the most common types of collisions for pedestrians on four-lane undivided, and it is very much alleviated with the addition or conversion of roads from four-lane undivided to three lanes. The other thing about introducing a three-lane road diet is that you can then introduce a median. This is shown in this figure. It's one of the few current crash modification factors that's contained in the Highway Safety Manual, which we'll talk about later, that relates to pedestrians so far, and it's pretty astounding the level of crash reduction you can get through just the introduction of a median refuge for pedestrians. It allows the pedestrian to essentially treat the crossing as two separate crossings, crossing one direction of travel and only having to pay attention to essentially one lane, then having a refuge in the center and then crossing a second lane, and again only having one lane of traffic to attend to. The other benefits to pedestrians from road diets are speed limit compliance. So essentially, it's if you have a four-lane configuration, the fastest vehicle can pass the slowest vehicle. You have a three-lane configuration in one lane in each direction. The slowest vehicle dictates the speed of the larger platoon of vehicles. So if one vehicle decides to comply with the posted speed limit, all other vehicles behind that vehicle will also be in compliance. Then a little bit more on actually, I'm going to get into a case study of a specific road diet that I should divulge. I did not work on this one, but it is near and dear to my heart. It actually took place when I was practicing as a professional in San Francisco, but I didn't actually work on this. This is a road diet in the city of San Francisco on a street called Valencia Street. This was implemented in late 1998. At the time, MTA, or what's now known as MTA, Metropolitan Transportation Authority of San Francisco, was then known as Department of Parking and Traffic, wasn't in favor of implementation of this road diet. I think at present, given the amount of cultural change that has taken place in that organization, they would be very supportive of this. But you have to think back to where in 1998 in terms of the norm and the expectations around moving automobiles. But anyways, the Board of Supervisors overrode MTA and said, you will implement a road diet. So the city of San Francisco implemented a road diet on Valencia Street. A little bit about Valencia Street. When I was growing up, actually fairly near to Valencia Street, it's in the Mission District. It was a tough district with a lot of gang violence. Over the decades since, it has really transformed pretty dramatically, especially Valencia Street. So where it was a tough place in the 70s, now it's probably the most heavily ridden from a bicycle perspective corridor in the city of San Francisco, with parklets and bike corrals and cafes and coffee shops and tons of restaurants. So it's transformed tremendously. I would say some of that transformation was already happening prior to implementation of the road diet, and that was part of the impetus for doing it. But much of that transformation was facilitated by the road diet and the really fundamental change in character that the two-phase road diet project had on the city as a whole. So it's also important to note that it is a fairly high volume street, 22,000 vehicles per day, and there was some concern that those vehicles would divert to adjacent streets. And I think it's a valid concern. The other thing about Valencia Street is it's both the bus route, even back with the implementation of the bike lanes, it had fairly heavy bike traffic. It's now got extremely heavy bike traffic. And it's fairly close to Mission, which is where two BART stations are located at 16th and 24th Street in San Francisco. So both as a result of that and as a result of its commercial character, it has a lot of pedestrian activity as well. Then some of the key findings from Valencia Street. So it was converted, actually in '99, from 4 to 3. The speed limit was posted, it was reposted as 25 miles an hour. Knowing MTA, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that they probably didn't just automatically repost it. They probably did the road diet, did a speed survey, used that to justify reducing the speed limit, and then reposted the speed limit. They did modify the signal timing to try to get a smoother flow at 25 miles an hour. And it was initially implemented as a temporary improvement. The result of that improvement, which and actually is a fairly low-cost one, you can see, so $130,000 for almost 2 miles of roadway. The results of that improvement were eventually made permanent, mostly because some of the fears that people had about traffic spilling over to adjacent streets just didn't happen, and the positive things that did happen on Valencia Street were also a big part of that. So the results of it were really no change in 82. The adjacent streets had some slight increase in traffic, but it was spread across so many parallel streets that it didn't really impact any of them. Maybe important to note that Valencia Street is part of a grid system. It's one of the real benefits of grid systems is you can spread traffic across multiple streets, and so doing things like road diets within a grid system is you have a lot more flexibility than you might in other street patterns where you don't have as much redundancy of the networks. It's a very significant increase in bicycle travel. So the bicycle collisions also went up by about 50%, but that was outpaced by the 140% increase in the total people using the facility. And then the city did, actually a private citizen who was supportive of the project that Ken was running, did some follow-up, essentially stated preference surveys with adjacent merchants and found that, and other people who were shopping along the street, and found that there's overwhelming support for it, and a very small marginal amount of people would like to undo it. But by and large, 65% were very positive, some were neutral, and then a very small percent, 4%, were negative about the overall benefits of the project. So as a result of that, the city went back and essentially said, well, that worked. It was really low cost. It's had a big transformative effect. What else could we do? And so they looked at a host of improvements that were significantly higher in cost, but also afforded some additional economic benefit opportunities, and really, I think, are what were most transformative about Valencia Street. So they widened the sidewalks, they widened the bike lanes, they implemented a whole bunch of bike corrals and parklets, bulb outs, increased the number of street trees and lighting, added a bunch of public art. And then they tried some innovative stuff as well, one of which is the Greenway, which essentially times the signals along Valencia. So if you're going 13 miles an hour, you will hit the green. So it became a preferred route for cyclists who were trying to travel longer distances and wanted to do so with the signals in their favor. And they also tried some experimentation with other things like the bike bays that are shown on the right of this image. So that's a successful case in San Francisco. And now I'm going to sort of get into some of the statistics that are presented on safety for road diets. And it's important to note that the November 2014 edition of the road diet guide does have some pretty significantly different statistics in it than the earlier version. And some of this is because of the introduction of a new statistical method for doing this type of analysis. And I'm not a statistician, so if anybody calls me on this, I'll defer to somebody else who knows the details of statistics. But the fundamental change has been the conduct of the safety analysis using the empirical Bayesian method, which in very layman terms, because that's all I know, essentially, rather than doing a true before-after, it tries to fit a series of collisions to a normal curve, and then it compares the before normal curve to the after normal curve as a better basis to really estimate what the overall statistical change in collisions was as a result of the introduction. So I'll be presenting a whole host of collision statistics in the next several slides. It's important to note that the ones that are presenting up front are the more recent ones that are done with the empirical Bayesian method, which is considered at this point the state of the practice. And then you'll see contradicting statistics in some of the later slides, and it's largely because they're performed doing a traditional before-after analysis. The other thing I want to note is that for the first several of these slides, you'll see the CMF, CRF, the quality, the sort of matrix you see through the middle of this slide, and I want to do a quick summary of what that is. These are essentially data presented from the Highway Safety Manual. The Highway Safety Manual is intended to be the equivalent of the Highway Design Manual, the Highway Capacity Manual, excuse me, except being able to assess what are the before-after effects of different safety countermeasures on actually predicting safety outcomes. It's pretty early in its evolution, so there aren't a lot of treatments that are currently, and especially pedestrian, for which we have crash modification factors. But what the Highway Safety Manual does is it presents both the CRF, which is the crash reduction factor, which is an actual estimate of the percentage change in crashes associated with the countermeasure, and the CMF, the crash modification factor, which is really a multiplier used to compute the expected number of crashes. So in terms of just understanding the order of magnitude of changes in collisions, it's probably easier to look at the CRF statistic. So in this case, you can see that the across this particular study, the road diet resulted in an average of a 29% reduction in collisions across all sites. It's also important to note this was taken from a number of different areas, and they had some disparity in sites as well. So for the small town sites that were included in this study that were in Iowa, they actually received or experienced a larger collision reduction, 47%. And then for some of the more suburban areas that were part of large metro areas, they experienced a lesser collision reduction, only 19% collision. So this is sort of the 29% is sort of the blend of all of those rates. The only other thing I'll point out is if you look at the quality, there's a number of stars there. So this is considered a 5-star piece of research. This is essentially describing the technical rigor of this particular effort. And you'll see that this is the only one that is a 5-star. The next one is an additional piece of research that really focuses on urban areas. It has 3 stars, so not quite as statistically rigorous as the fire, but not a very significantly different set of results. So a 37% decrease in crashes within the urban areas. And then the next one has a similar set of data, but for suburban areas. It's a 4-star piece of research, but you can see it's showing a pretty significantly larger increase in collisions. I think one of the things you should look at if you're going to start looking at a road diet is start to look into the details, especially of these 3 studies, to see if you can figure out where it is your particular road diet example would fit into sort of on a typology basis, and you may be able to refine your estimates of what you think the collision reductions could be as a result of implementation of a road diet. Then for those of you who have been looking at road diet projects for a long time, you probably remember this. I think it was first published by Dan Burton and Peter Lagerwey in the 90s as part of a road diet guide that they put out way back when. And it shows a series of road diets that became sort of the impetus for a national trend around road diets. So these are all in the Seattle area, mostly from the 90s, one from the 70s. And the statistics they presented were pretty compelling, and sort of it's an ode to them that we're putting this in here. So you can see that the 2 fears about road diets were, one is due to traffic, and there's that traffic divert elsewhere, and then maybe not so much a fear, but wanting to understand what is the implication of this from a safety perspective, I think with the expectation that it would reduce collisions, but maybe not with the expectation that it would reduce collisions as much as this particular study showed. So you can see that by and large the statistics for volume are that the volumes hold steady, and that the collisions reductions vary by facility but are pretty significant. So an average of 34%, but some as high as 61%. Just on that, my own experience in the first several road diets that I worked on, where we did a lot of before-after analysis, was essentially about a 50% reduction, and those were primarily in suburbs of San Francisco. So pretty syncs up well with my own experience with doing road diets. So there are a number of considerations on when you want to do road diets. I think the biggest scenario, the most common scenario for wanting to do a road diet really relates to safety. If you have a history of especially rear end and side swipe collisions for automobiles and or multiple threat collisions for pedestrians, then it's a good candidate for a road diet. But it has a number of other benefits as well, including reducing speeds, which can improve the livability of a corridor, especially if you have a residential facility that you're trying to do a road diet on. If you don't have any dedicated turn pockets, that's potentially a good reason to do it, in that you could provide those left turn pockets and receive the safety benefits associated with that. And then the other one is just about policy direction. So I want to caveat that one in particular, because the rest of this, throughout this presentation, there are several organizations that have prepared guides for when it is practical to consider a road diet, and often those pivot directly from traffic volumes. And I think that's probably a pretty good rationale for consideration, but it shouldn't necessarily be the only factor that's considered. So like I said, I've worked on road diets for a road with as much as 28,000 vehicles per day, and there was a policy decision by the city council of that city that they were willing to live with the increased travel time and congestion and queue length that resulted from implementation of a road diet on that street. Actually didn't find nearly as much of that as we thought in the after study. But anyway, they had made the policy decision that that was something they were willing to live with, primarily because 2 people were struck and killed in crosswalks. And so there was a political will to do something. And unfortunately, that's frequently the reason that many jurisdictions consider road diets, is because bad things have happened on 4-lane undivided roads. But as I said, there are a number of other jurisdictions that have sort of guidelines for when to consider. So here across the left are the number of jurisdictions that have published implementation considerations, and then across the top of this is the various factors that they've considered. And it is the ones you would expect to see. I think one of the most important ones is to look at the turn percentages in particular, and we'll talk about that later on, especially as it relates to whether implementation of road diet really does degrade the capacity of the facility. So here's a case in point of a city, this is Seattle. It's very progressive, who does have a guideline for implementation of road diets. And you can see that if the volume of traffic exceeds 25,000 vehicles per day, at least according to this chart, it's not a street on which they would consider a road diet. I suspect that there's policy overrides for this as well, even for them. But you can see that they have a nice process in place for sort of below that. So if it's 15,000 vehicles per day or greater, they would do a full corridor analysis, really understand the implications of the road diet, not just from an individual or isolated intersection perspective, but from the travel time perspective along a longer corridor. If it's between 10 and 16,000 vehicles per day, then they would really focus on a couple of key intersections, which is generally what we have done, is to focus in on those intersections that are most congested and analyze the impacts of those, and then maybe also look at a couple unsignalized intersections to understand how it's going to affect some of those. And then you can see if it's less than 10,000 vehicles per day in Seattle, they don't require any analysis. It's just a candidate for a road diet. Then other studies have come up with other recommendations for this. So the key takeaway from this is that there's at least one case study from UNC Highway Research Center that talks about using peak hour volumes, so 1,700 vehicles in the peak hour, which they say equates to roughly 20,000 to 24,000 vehicles per day. And then there are a host of other guidelines, some sort of more formal and some less formal. So the one on the far left is actually written by a good friend of mine, Jennifer Rosales, who wrote this when she was with Parsons Bakerhoff. The one in the middle is written by University of Kentucky, and the one on the right is the FHWA guide that was just republished in November of 2014. And I'll talk about each really quickly and really sort of highlight what's unique about them. So first, Jennifer's research. It is a good guide and has a number of case studies and examples throughout it. I think the thing that most impressed me about this research is that it actually has a livability survey in it, so a survey of residents affected by road diet. It really demonstrates that from a livability perspective, getting out or beyond collisions and volumes and so forth, if you actually live along the corridor, road diets have pretty significant benefits to that group of citizens. Then the Kentucky one is actually pretty detailed. It has a lot of detail in it with respect to operations as well as safety. And it also has a series of cross-sectional sort of case and points identified throughout it. In terms of the operations, they look at a critical lane volume method, which some of you may remember as being the old planning method in the highway capacity manual. But it essentially looks at what are the movements that are conflicting with one another at a signalized intersection and quantifies those. So a good example would be a northbound through and a southbound left. If those two are not moving during the same signal phase, you would add up the number of vehicles that are served on each of those to get to essentially a critical lane volume planning level calculation of whether there is sufficient capacity to accommodate, in this case, a road diet. And you can see they actually looked at a number of different scenarios, looking at different signal phasings, whether it's two-phase, three-phase, or more than three-phase, and really found that there's not very significant operational changes as a result of road diets, that essentially, however the intersection operated before, if it was congested before, it's probably congested after. If it wasn't congested before, it's probably not congested after. They did go into more detail than even that. So they looked at delay comparisons for side streets are based on, this is to the main volume, but based on how much traffic is approaching from the side street. And generally found that on average, the far right column of this, they're experiencing less than a second in change in delay, so really low amount of additional change. And they also looked at unsignalized intersections and found similarly that, actually they found something that I find a little counterintuitive, which is that at the unsignalized intersections, the side street volume delays were even less. My experience with road diet, especially on the higher volume into the volume range, is that because the main street has all of the traffic in one lane, it sometimes has longer queues, and as a result, it's a little more difficult to get out of the side streets. So that's my own experience, but I'll assume that the experience in Kentucky was based on probably lower volumes of road diet examples. But Kentucky publishes a set of guidelines of when you might consider the road diet that relates to the volume of Main Street and side street. And then they did also do an analysis of queues and show that there's less than a vehicle's worth of additional queue as a result of implementation of road diets. And then they finally came up with this sort of guideline for candidates. So as I said, it's generally actually, I'm sorry, this is all three. So Jennifer's just got the footnote of 1, Kentucky is footnote of 2, and then the original Ken Burden and Peter Lager Way research has a footnote of 3. But you can see they're all pretty much in sync with one another in terms of the range of volumes between 20 and 23,000 vehicles per day, 1,700, maybe 1,500, 1,750 in terms of vehicles per hour. And then the case studies, you can see several of them have higher volumes than that, including some in Seattle. Then other considerations for road diets. The primary one is buses. So I'll give you an example of one road diet I worked on Outer Mission Street in San Francisco, which is an area that has 4-lane undivided with on-street parking. Heavy bus traffic. Also heavy left turn movements. And one of the considerations was that the passengers on the muni buses were complaining about getting sloshed, essentially, that there was so much double parking occurring for the retail businesses that don't have off-street loading, and really sort of poor habits built up over time and light enforcement of double parking regulations along this particular section of Mission Street, such that buses would routinely change lanes to the left in order to get out behind a car that had stopped to double park, and then have to change lanes to the right to get out behind a car that was about to turn left at an adjacent driveway or intersection, and passengers were just getting sloshed around. So in this case, it's kind of interesting. We recommended a road diet and then essentially striping out a flex space. So rather than an official bike zone, which we knew was going to get double parked in, we striped a fog line further out from the curb with the expectation that cyclists would use it. but allowing some flexibility in that space. Other things about road diets are that they really are a wonderful addition with roundabouts. And I'll give you my little spiel on roundabouts is that I'm a big fan of single lane roundabouts. You can really accomplish significant safety benefits and maintain really good traffic flow through these facilities, especially if you look at it on an average vehicle delay perspective. They often perform significantly better than signalized intersections. I do not feel the same about multi-lane roundabouts. It's really difficult to accomplish the deflection that results in appropriate speeds through roundabouts, especially in off-peak periods through multi-lane roundabouts. So I just feel like roundabouts are generally good to consider, not only in many instances, but I'm a big fan if they're single-lane roundabouts and not nearly as big fan if they're multi-lane roundabouts. And so one of the real impetuses to doing road diets is that you could do more single-lane roundabouts. Initially had a simulation for you to actually look at this slide, but given the number of viewers of this presentation, we decided to remove that because it would have been choppy for you all to see it. But suffice it to say, you can look at one of the things you can do to build consensus around and maybe understanding operational implications of a road diet is simulation. You can do that in Corson, which actually the Kentucky study based a lot of its results on Corson analysis. You can do that in NISM, which we've done in a number of cases, and it's particularly good if you're going to take it to a public for viewing, because NISM can produce some pretty high-end simulations. Or you can use a safety surrogate assessment model, but there's lots of different tools you can use to simulate conditions with the road diets. Obviously, a little more expensive from planning the road diet perspective to prepare a simulation. So you want to use it sparingly, but particularly where you're trying to build consensus, it might be a good tool for you to consider. Then some design considerations around road diets. And before I jump into the road diets, I just want to cover one that's more general. I'm sure many of you have seen the research, several pieces, at least two actually, pieces of research that have come out in the relatively recent past that relate to lane widths and speeds. So this is a piece of research by Kay Fitzpatrick with the Texas Transportation Institute, amongst others, that really indicates that lane widths do have an immediate or a direct effect on speeds. So the general takeaway was that when lane widths were 3.3 feet greater, or about a meter, 85th percentile speeds were generally about 9.4, almost 10 miles an hour faster. There's also other research out there that indicates that there's no safety benefit or safety disbenefit to reducing lanes from 12 to 11 or 10-foot lanes, that there's no statistically significant change in the collision history associated with those roadways. So there's a pretty strong sense that beyond reduction of the number of lanes, that there's also a strong impetus for reducing the width of lanes, especially in urban areas. And then just one more point on that, which is this one shows 12-foot lanes. This example, so we're going to walk through 3 different cross-sectional examples. This one's a 48-foot cross-section. And you can see that in this case, we've retained a 12-foot travel lane. If this is an urban area, then we probably would recommend 11-foot travel lanes if it has heavy bus and truck traffic, and then even 10-foot travel lanes if it has even less. It doesn't have buses and trucks. An important note in California, where I recently came from, the Highway Design Manual, the sort of Bible for design facilities there, now recommends 11-foot travel lanes in urban city-town centers, where speeds are less than 40 miles an hour and heavy truck and bus movements are less than 250 AADT. So there's a pretty strong movement that way. So while this one shows the 12-foot travel lanes and 6-foot bike, you could easily go with narrower travel lanes and either reallocate the space to wider bike lanes or buffered bike lanes, or you could reallocate the space to a wider median. I didn't prepare these particular cross-sections, so you'll see in the after cross-section they split this in as if it was a cycle track, but it's important to note that if you're going to do a cycle track, you actually need a 3-foot buffer on the between the parked car and the right lane, so you would actually need to have, where it's saying 5.5 in the lower cross-section, you need to have a minimum of 8 there. So in this case, I would actually recommend either changing the cross-section such that you can accomplish the 8 feet in that area, or putting in a traditional bike lane rather than the cycle track. And you can see in this case they have recommended reduction of this from 12-foot travel lanes to 11-foot travel lanes. And the final example is one where you have an extra wide right-of-way, 70 feet. And so this is one where, again, going from 4 with on-street, with a center turn pocket as well as on-street bike lanes to 3. And then in this case, you really can do a fully separated cycle track. You have sufficient width for the parking, the buffer, and then the cycle track behind it. I should note that I'm a big fan of the cycle tracks, but I do recommend that you look at them beyond just a cross-sectional perspective and look at how they work through intersections, in particular looking at the turn conflicts across the cycle tracks. And then the last cross-section example in this one shows diagonal parking, which we'll talk about in a moment, but we would probably recommend back-in diagonal parking. If you're going to put a bike lane adjacent to diagonal parking, it should be back-in angle parking where possible. So that's the other thing you can gain is just on-street parking. One of the road diets I worked on actually had a bike lane for 3 miles, and then within one section, which was sort of the downtown commercial core of a particular street, we dropped the bike lane into the bike route for about a half-block length, which was not what we wanted to do, but it was enough of a change to get the merchants who were trying to get angled parking out, so more parking supply out of this project, to give them what they were wanting, and then we enlisted their support and had no objectors to the project. So that's sort of one of the trade-offs we made in that one. But angled parking, or converting from either parallel to angle or going from zero parking to parallel parking, is another potential benefit of road diets if you're not interested in reallocating the space to bikes, to peds. Then quickly to talk about intersection treatments. This is a case in point in Berkeley, California. You can actually, you can't see in the pre-example of this. So what's shown in this image is the after example. But this is a good case in point of what I was talking about earlier in terms of the number of approach lanes you can get if you do a road diet. This was a 4-lane undivided, so it had 2 approach lanes at this signalized intersection, which is at the top of Marin Avenue, which is another street that went through a road diet a couple of years prior. And so they previously had a shared through left and a shared through right. You can see with the implementation of road diets in this case, they actually got an increase in the number of lanes at this approach to the intersection as a result, because there are heavy left turns in particular. I would guess that they didn't see any degradation of the capacity of this. The intersection as a whole. The other thing you can do once you have things like a protected left turn lane is you can actually have a protected left turn phases at signalized intersections. So particularly where you have left turns that are in conflict with a particularly heavy pedestrian movement in the crosswalk, it allows you to consider phase separating the left turn from the pedestrian movement. Actually, just down Marin Avenue, the Marin Avenue is the cross street here, which as I said earlier is another road diet. There is a school called Marin School where they implemented exactly that, protected left turns, and it has really been well received by the crossing guards and parents and kids who are crossing with other patients. You can also, in certain cases, do overlap right turn phases when you have dedicated right turn pockets. So it just allows you some more flexibility in how you can signalize the intersection. You should make sure that whenever you change signalizations, you consider things like pedestrian clearance intervals and change them to the new standard, and also look at ADA upgrades. And another point I want to make about road diets is opportunities to enhance crosswalks. This is one of the takeaways that we've had from several of the higher volume road diets that we've worked on, especially those that have frequent uncontrolled intersections, is that if you look at the new guidance in the MUTCD, which is getting much more prescriptive about how to treat uncontrolled crosswalks and getting into things like pedestrian hybrid beacons and rapid rectangular flashing beacons, you start to look at the guidelines for when it is you should implement those. In several corridors that we've looked at, we found that if we didn't do a road diet, we were going to be implementing multiple sets of intersection crosswalk enhancements, and that the cost of those crosswalk enhancements was actually significantly greater than doing the road diet, even when we weren't doing an overlay concurrent with the road diet. So it is another thing to think about. Is just if you're going to try to improve pedestrian conditions, and in my view, the MUTCD is sort of getting more and more rigid about that, and we're all going to be required to make improvements in the not too distant future. It's still a little soft, but less soft than it used to be. Then it's another thing to sort of contrast the costs of doing the road diet change versus making all these intersection or crosswalk upgrades. Then there are also other things you can do in terms of higher costs, and I do think mostly want to show the bottom right of this. So you can obviously widen sidewalks. That was something that we talked about on Valencia Street. Certainly great if you have the resources to do it. New York, as you may know, has been experimenting with sort of soft hit posts and other tactical urbanism elements that get some of the benefit out of the widened space for pedestrian realm without necessarily the higher costs associated with moving curbs and gutters and so forth. And then quickly on bike features, there are a couple of different guides that are used out there. The AASHTO bike guide is the one that's sort of tried and true and researched and probably most protected from liability risk if you employ its design practices. But the more recent one, the one people are pretty excited about, is the National Association of City Transportation Officials, NACTO. It's important to note that NACTO is essentially the equivalent of AASHTO. AASHTO is the Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials. NACTO is the same, except it's an aggregation of large cities rather than state DOTs. But there are some key differences between NACTO and AASHTO. One is that AASHTO has either got sort of a lot of research to substantiate the views that are expressed there, or that it's just sort of got historical practices embedded into it. And NACTO has mostly well-researched treatments, but there are several treatments that are not completely researched, and for which it would be nice to have research. And that's maybe the other significant difference in AASHTO and NACTO. AASHTO has pretty significant resources to conduct research, and NACTO generally has very little. So it's sort of the unfortunate thing about the two, because it would be great if we could actually get real-world research into what the safety benefits of many of the treatments promoted in NACTO is. This slide shows several of the treatments that are currently in NACTO, and it's important, and also highlights some of the things that are not consistent with the MUTCD. So on the pictures on the left, these are mostly compliant with the MUTCD, but the MUTCD says that where you dash the lines on the outside, the white lines, you also should dash the green. So pretty minor changes to the design of this one to make it compliant. The treatments on the right, which are what some people call elephant tracks on the top right, and the bottom was the super sharrows, and this is actually through a portion of a street called the Wiggle in San Francisco, are not yet included in the AASHTO White Guide or AASHTO design manuals. Two-stage turn boxes, which I actually have pretty significant concerns about, mostly because all the research I've seen about them shows that most riders don't use them in the way that they're intended to be used. Not that they shouldn't be used, but I would like to see more research to substantiate their benefits. Are actually going to be included in the next edition of MUTCD, or that's what all indications are. There's a placeholder for it now. And it is considered experimental. You are permitted to use it. Generally, the process is to request permission to experiment, but in this case, FHWA is issuing they're allowing that experimentation. I mentioned earlier that I talked quickly about back-end angle parking, and so let me do that now. There are some major safety benefits to this. One is that the most significant is the person who's in the car can see the cyclist approaching as you're backing out, and as forward and angle parking, that's not scenarios. Other benefits are that the person getting out of the car, especially getting a child out of the back door, doesn't have to go around the car door. They can actually go straight to the sidewalk. And then other things are just loading and loading over your trunk are easier. Then some disadvantages to back-end angle parking. One is that if you do have furniture zones or trees or other things, the tail end of a car tends to be longer than the front end of a car, so you generally want to set those back further, or put in curb stops so that your features don't get struck. And then at least at present, while we still have gas-powered vehicles, the exhaust from your vehicle, if you started, especially on cold start, is going towards or on the sidewalk. Then a couple of last slides just on best practices, one on cost and one on best practice. One is just to say the best practice in terms of cost, in reducing costs, is to try to do the road diets as part of planned overlay projects. You still have to look at signal head modifications and potentially relocating loop detectors. But if you do it as part of an overlay, it's really just striping. It's pretty low cost. And then the best practice, in order to make sure you take that maximum advantage of that, is really to have a queue up of the projects that you're going to do in pavement overlay, and have already sort of worked the magic on what the benefits of the road diet might be, or if it is a good candidate for said. And if you think you're expecting any community opposition, to have vetted that with the community. So by the time you're ready to hire contractors to go out to do, or do it yourself, to do the pavement overlay, you've already sort of done your homework on analysis and building community support for the project. Then real quickly, I'll just run through one final case study, which is Nickerson Street in Seattle. I didn't work on this one either, but it's a case where they did a 4-lane conversion, 4 to 3, added bike lanes, kept the posted speed limit at 30, and you can see they also kept pretty wide travel lanes because it's a major truck route. A bunch of goals were around pedestrian safety and adding actually a couple of crosswalks, reducing multiple threat collisions, trying to get better compliance with the 30-mile-an-hour speed limit and overall reduction of speeds. And you can see that what I think is interesting about this is that they did look at speeds in 3 different ways. One, they looked at it from the traditional 85th percentile, which is the top box. Then they looked at it from the percentage of vehicles that are traveling over the posted speed limit speeders. You can see even more marked reduction in the number of vehicles doing that, as much as 64%. And then they finally looked at the top-end speeders, the drivers that are going over 10 miles an hour over the posted speed limit in the very bottom box, and you can see a very marked reduction in the number of vehicles that are doing that. So one of the real benefits of road diet is not only that it reduces the average speed, but it reduces the most offensive speeds the most. They also got a 23% reduction in collisions, so another data point. And then no real change in traffic volumes as a result of the road diet. And then finally, they also looked at freight and found lift and move trucks, and found that there's really no change in the truck traffic as a result of the road diet either. And so I'll end there. There are a number of resources available for you if you're interested in doing some of your additional research. So we have questions and answers.
Great. Thank you, Matthew. That's helpful. And actually, what I may do for a second here, if you don't mind keeping your screen up, I'd like to keep this slide visible so people have a chance to maybe jot down a few of those resources while we're talking through the questions. I sent out earlier in the webinar, I sent out a comment, or I probably came through as a comment, but it was a link to that 2014 FHWA road diet guide that was mentioned a few times in the presentation. So definitely take a look at that. I'd encourage you, especially if you're interested in some of the information that Matthew shared about safety effectiveness and crash evaluations, some of the differences in the methodologies that were used in those different studies that Matthew mentioned to arrive at the different crash modification factors. That's outlined and summarized really well in that guide. So that's a great place to look for some of those safety benefits. We've got quite a few questions here, so I'll just go through them, and Matthew, just we'll see your thoughts on these, and Peter, if you'd like to weigh in on any of them, feel free to do that, and we'll just have a discussion here. You mentioned, excuse me, some of the benefits, a lot of the benefits, and some of the costs associated with doing road diet conversions. Can you talk at all about when calculating the benefits? You mentioned some of these studies, some of these crash modification factors, and talking about safety benefits. Can you just clarify for the safety benefits and the crash reductions that the research shows, are these benefits, or those crash benefits reductions for all users, for pedestrians specifically, for bicyclists, or how does that all break down?
Yeah, so all the statistics I presented in terms of crash reductions were for all users. So it includes primarily, as I said earlier, it's mostly autos because we have more auto-to-auto collisions than any other type of collision, but it does include bicycle and pedestrian-related collisions as well in all of those statistics.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point for in terms of making the case for road diets. I think one of the important things for folks to highlight is the fact that the safety benefits are relevant for all users of the road. So these aren't just pedestrian safety improvements. They're motorist improvements, they're bicyclist improvements. They're going to increase safety for everyone, and I think that can be an important selling point. I think when trying to convince agencies to go with road diets in corridors.
Sure, for sure.
And can you say, you mentioned this a bit when you were talking about speed reduction and lane width. Say one more time some of the research that's been coming out about decreasing lane width and what that does in terms of a change in crashes, going from maybe a 12 to an 11 or 10-foot lane.
Yeah, so I'm trying to remember the authors of the research, and Dan, if you recall it, you're welcome to throw it in there. But the research that I've seen is related specifically to safety. The slide I showed was really related to speed, but the research I've seen related to safety was really demonstrating that there was no safety disbenefit to reducing travel lanes from 12 to 11 or 10. That is to say that they found no statistically significant change in collision patterns as a result of changing lanes from 12, either from 12 to 10 or 12 to 11. For roadways of less than 45 miles an hour, I think it was. It was Ingrid Potts, I believe, is the name of the primary researcher. So if you Google Ingrid Potts and lane width safety, I'm sure you can find that piece of research. But it was pretty well prepared. And I don't know, Dan, if you have anything to add to that. Or
yeah, no, just that I think that taking the topic of road diets and conversions, traditionally it's decreasing the overall number of lanes to make room for other features, bike lanes, center turn lanes, things like that. But they're at the same time, in addition to reducing the number of lanes, the lane widths themselves can sometimes be reduced. And I think that that's maybe a feature that is overlooked and can really help create some of that extra space, especially when you're thinking about things like cycle tracks or separated bike lanes where you do need that extra buffer space beyond your parked vehicles. So
yep.
Just an opportunity to take advantage of some of the width that's already out there.
For sure.
I'd ask you, so generally from your experience, I mean, you've worked on a number of these. Have you had any or come across any examples of locations where maybe road diets were tried and possibly didn't work out and had to be changed back to their original configuration?
I haven't worked on one personally, but I have seen that there was a case in point. I'm trying to remember the exact name of the road, but it was in Palo Alto, California, that I recall that there was a temporary installation of a road diet that was ultimately removed. And there's also a case in point, I don't know if that's actually road diet in terms of reduction of number of lanes, but I'm pretty sure it was in San Luis Obispo. In both cases, those projects had something in common, which is that they were installed on a temporary basis. And I don't think that the traffic flow is as uniform in a temporary installation as you get if you do it on a permanent basis. And I think the other thing, especially in the case of the San Luis Obispo one, was that it was ugly. That when you use soft hit posts and temporary treatments, it's not very attractive. And so if you're trying to convince a series of residents and of merchants that this is a good idea, putting a treatment out, whether it's temporary or permanent, that is ugly, is maybe not your most convincing foot forward. So I know that when we look at these, we generally, at this point, recommend, especially since there's not really, in most cases, much in the way of a capacity degradation as a result of road diets, that we recommend that you don't install it on a temporary basis, that you go ahead and install it on a permanent basis. And if you have to unstripe it, that if you were going to do sort of a temporary installation, you might do it in paint for the initial year and then come back and do it in thermoplastic in the subsequent cycle of your maintenance. But don't try to sort of fake it in with a series of potentially unattractive temporary features.
Those are excellent points. I sort of on the same lines. When you talk about some groups or we get some questions, I guess, on this webinar about different folks who may be opposed to a road diet conversion. I mean, in your experience, is there a typical argument against doing road diets that may or may not be sort of a well-founded one, or a good, or maybe possibly an argument against road diets that you found to not really hold up?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard for, I think, people to grasp that you could remove travel lanes, one in each direction, without significant impacts on capacity. And you certainly can't do that in all cases. If you have the majority of the vehicles in your fleet are heading through, they're not turning left or right, then or you have a facility that actually has center turn pockets, so oftentimes you have a 4-lane undivided, but then at intersections that removed on-street parking and you've added turn pockets and so forth. That if you have that kind of facility, it's really actually impossible to make the argument that there isn't some degradation of capacity. But if you're truly doing a 4 to 3 conversion where you don't have turn pockets under existing conditions and you have anything like the normal level of turn percentages, then the capacity disbenefits are really minimal associated with doing road diets. But it's really difficult to convince people that that is the case. It just doesn't sound like it passes the sniff test for some people. Let me get this straight. You're going to reduce the number of lanes, but I won't experience any additional delay. So that's the primary argument that we receive against implementation of road diets. And it's amazing how many we've done and then had community members come up afterwards and say, I was wrong, or just that the tenor of the opposition, the tone of the opposition essentially dies off as soon as the project has been implemented. In several cases, we've had follow-up studies or in our scopes to go out and do after studies and not had to do them because there was really no longer any controversy about what the benefits or disbenefits of the road diet was going to be after it was implemented.
Yeah, excellent. You talked a lot about the oh, I'm sorry, Peter, were you going to point?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of throw in a couple comments here with regards to the question as far as reversing, and I think Matthew's comment with regards to the public. I think I've heard a couple instructors give examples of this where, and I won't name the state, that where they went and they realized that the road diet would work because the numbers were pretty low and it was a sure thing that operational-wise it would work. But however, they didn't reach out to the public and in that neighborhood just because they didn't do that communication portion and get the public involvement. The neighborhood was upset with that, and so even though it worked fine, they went and reversed it just because of the controversy of not being communicated to. So operational-wise, we can make it all work, but that is an important piece to be communicating.
Great, and I apologize for the rest of the audience. I didn't introduce Peter. Peter Unn is with the Federal Highway Administration's Resource Center and has been doing a lot of the training on these topics as well. So thanks, Peter, for joining us and offering that comment.
Sure, and maybe one other just quick plug. I don't know if everybody realizes that Federal Highways has designated road diets as an everyday counts initiative, and so there is Becky Crow and Keith Harrison from Federal Highways that are lead in this area, and if they want to just Google Federal Highways everyday counts road diets, there's a lot of opportunities to get more technical assistance in this area. So just want to let people know that opportunity exists.
Great. Thanks, Peter. A couple questions came in. We're mainly focusing here on the 4-lane to 3-lane conversions, but a couple of questions came in about converting a 5-lane section, 2 lanes in each direction, and a 2-way left turn down to a 3-lane, so 1 lane in each direction and a 2-way left turn. Can you speak, Matthew, to your experience with those sorts of conversions? I mean, clearly you're drastically reducing the number of lanes in those cases, although you maintain the center turn lane in both. Any differences maybe in the safety benefits or other features?
Yeah, for sure. There are differences. So as I said, the 4-lane undivided and the 6-lane undivided, for that matter, both have really poor safety performance. But when you get into 5 lanes, some of the safety benefits we talked about in terms of reducing the rear-end collisions as well as the side swipes that are really a function of one vehicle stopping in a through lane in order to make left into a driveway or a side street where there isn't a dedicated left turn pocket, that you're not going to get the safety benefits of that. You're also not going to get the, it is truly a reduction of capacity at that point. You already have left turn pockets. You already have the ability to can signalize and do protected lefts if you want to do protected left signalization and some of the other treatments. So we still have done a number of 5 to 3 conversions, generally in locations where there's pretty strong pedestrian considerations, because one of the characteristics you don't eliminate in the 5-lane configuration is the double jeopardy for pedestrians and we're trying to do improvements for cyclists. And one of the real benefits of doing a 5 to 3 is that you have a lot of room to work with. So you can do some pretty robust improvements for bicyclists as a result of that. So yeah, especially if you have relatively low volumes fitting into the range that we were talking about throughout this presentation, 20,000 vehicles per day. And you have it accommodated in a 5-lane cross-section. That's really many more lanes than you need. So I would still encourage you to consider road diets in those instances. But you need to be real with the community in terms of painting that you don't have quite the safety benefits that you would get out of a 4 to 3 conversion. And it really is a taking of capacity.
Okay. Okay. Some questions coming in from folks who are working with very particular stakeholder groups such as emergency responders, trucking or freight organizations, transit agencies, all of whom are responsible for sort of negotiating getting large vehicles through corridors, and may express some opposition to reducing the number of lanes or performing these road diets. Do you have particular recommendations for folks who are working with these types of groups to bring them into the process and help explain some of the benefits and maybe why the conversions may not be as bad of an option for them, even though they are maybe looking at the roadway a bit differently?
Sure. Yeah, my biggest recommendation is if you're trying to implement a road diet, go talk to your emergency responders before you get to any type of public hearing, especially at city council or something. The last thing you want is to be taking your project forward and having your fire chief say, I don't support this. So enlist them early. And I think there is some convincing that's necessary. So you can try the tack of the safety benefits associated with not having to serve as many collisions that would take place on these facilities. It should be part of their calculus in addition to what their travel time on that road is. But I think that the even more convincing argument that we've made is if it's really being done as part of a pavement overlay, you're not doing corner bulbs and some of the other more expensive components of road diets, you haven't changed the traveled way width at all. When they come blaring up that street with emergency sirens going, vehicles will pull into, if you're going to get designated a bike lane, they'll pull into the bike lane. It actually creates more uniformity in terms of where it is vehicles pull to get out of their way when they're coming through an emergency situation. And in the case of, in this area, we have evacuation routes for heavy weather and flooding events and so forth. If there was a desire to have the original 4 lanes going out during a heavy event of that nature, people will pick it. So it's, I guess my thought is that there's no, in an emergency, people behave differently than they would in a normal situation, and they will use all of the lanes or use all of the space in the roadway in whatever way is going to serve their needs best to get out of that area. So if you haven't changed the paved width of the road, then you haven't really changed the conditions for them. So those are the arguments that we generally take forward. Okay.
Okay. Very good. You made a comment. Oh, go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, I was wondering if I can do a follow-up question with that, because this is one of the areas where maybe there hasn't been as much research, but just Matthew's opinion on with regards to transit, because even though emergency situations they're more random on a transit route, on a corridor, if they're looking at a road diet, and you have buses that are going to be making stops, can you talk a little bit about how to do that analysis on a transit route and we realize even though we're promoting road diets here, not every road diet or not every road is a good candidate for a road diet. So just because maybe the numbers are there are things that you do need to consider. And so this isn't a fix-all, but so everything needs to be analyzed. And we're not saying that every road needs to go to a road diet, but just so maybe you can address the transit question a little further.
Sure, and we have done work with transit agencies and very much had the experience that you're talking about, where the transit agency will say, not only do they not want the road diet in terms of the number of, reducing the number of lanes, they don't want the road diet in terms of reducing the width of the lanes. And you have to understand that they're serving a group of drivers who, when their mirrors are out, those vehicles are 10.5 feet wide, so that they have a particular bent around road diets. And so let me start by saying, in terms of a technical response, I haven't seen a single study that says that there is either any change in travel speeds for transit vehicles with or without the implementation of a road diet. And I'm not saying that I've seen studies that show that there's none. I'm saying that this is an area that is ripe for research, that I really would like to see a substantive piece of research to look at this and either substantiate the view that on certain volume streets, road diets really do have disbenefits for transit, or help us get over that hump, because it is an obstacle that we face on a regular basis. And then the other thing I'll note is that there are treatments you can put into place. If it is a transit priority corridor, you still could implement the road diet, but implement things like corner bulbs or bus bulbs that essentially moves the bus stop out to the edge of the traveled way, such that the bus would pull across. If you put in a bike lane, they'd pull across the bike lane and block the bike lane, but they would still have part of their vehicle blocking the through travel lane. And so then that really reduces the delay associated with re-entering traffic. One of the biggest delay sources for transit, especially local routes that have lots of stops, is that once they've gotten out of traffic, it can be difficult to get back into traffic. And so having the bus bulbs is something that results in more delay for vehicular traffic on that street, although generally not that much unless the bus frequency is pretty high. But it has real benefits for transit vehicles in terms of they don't have to compete to get back into the travel lane after they've picked up their passenger. And the bus bulbs also have other safety benefits in terms of really daylighting the bus users, so that if there's also a crosswalk adjacent, there's safety benefits associated with reducing width of the crossing, as well as making the pedestrian in the crossing more visible, or in the crosswalk at the bulb more visible, and then having more space for bus amenities at those bus bulbs, so you can have room for a shelter or other amenities that you might not have the width for given to the bus bulb.
That's very good. One question about a stakeholder group I guess we haven't talked about much, and I wonder what are some of the selling points you can make for talking with business owners in particular along a corridor. You mentioned some of the studies that you've participated in, some of the projects where businesses were reached out to get input on the project, and in some cases maybe there were some trade-offs with getting a road diet through. Can you talk maybe a bit about some of the opposition that businesses along the corridor may have to a road diet, and possibly some of the selling points for them in terms of how a road diet conversion might benefit them? One that I would think of off the top of my head would be if the project involved the addition of on-street parking, where some space was taken from a previous lane, that might be a benefit to a local business. Can you talk about any other reasons why a business might actually support a bike road diet in other places of business?
Yeah, sure, and you're absolutely right that the business owners, they often have a really visceral reaction to talk about road diets, and I understand why. I mean, this is their business, their livelihood that you're putting at risk, and so it's easier to do nothing than it is to do something, to take a risk on whether this is going to be an improvement or disbenefit to their overall business. So first of all, put yourself in their shoes and understand that they're not trying to stop you for reasons that are unjustified. They have a really legitimate concern about what their operation is going to be like after this road is converted. But you're right, Dan, the benefits, there is emerging research that really demonstrates that people who are on foot and people who are cycling are much more likely to stop and frequent local businesses. So if there's an argument to be made that the road diet is going to increase the number of people who are stopping to shop, and that's another element of the Valencia Street before after study that they didn't talk about, but they did do an analysis of the number of shopping trips that occurred before and after, and found that the number of shopping trips went up pretty significantly. So you can sort of demonstrate through that kind of an argument. You're right, Dan, in that if you're implementing on-street parking where you didn't have it before, whether it actually has as much benefit as the merchants think it does, there's a perception that the addition of on-street parking in front of my business means people are going to stop and shop more frequently. And then the thing that we've done when we anticipate concern about implementation of road diet on these types of streets is really to go directly to the Chamber of Commerce and present the robust piece of research around what the safety benefits are, around what the user benefits are, around that there isn't actually going to be a reduction in capacity or potentially not, depending on the configuration they're going to, and then talk about what happens when you slow down traffic and how they can view your business and those types of improvements. So yeah, it's important to hit those early and hopefully have them at least partially on your side, if not all the way on your side, before the meeting goes to a public context.
Great. Excellent. You made a really good point, Matthew, toward the middle, I believe, of your presentation, where you encourage agencies, if they're thinking about some of your multi-lane corridors, instead of spending all this money on, focusing on improving certain crossings with different treatments, to maybe can offset that or compare that, I guess, with the cost of possibly doing a road diet where you're actually going to be narrowing the crossing distance and possibly reducing the number of lanes, anyway, when maybe you wouldn't have to spend as much on the crossing improvement itself. Can you say a little bit more about what goes into that decision making? Looking at maybe a hawk or a rapid flashing beacon versus a road diet that may actually reduce some of the conflict and some of the volume and speed issues.
Sure, and it's not just the upfront cost, it's the operating cost and maintenance costs. I mean, the types of installations that you're talking about for pedestrian hazard beacons and rapid rectangular flashing beacons, anything that has a light in it is going to require maintenance as well. So there's other benefits to the long-term costs of operating your system to the road diet over those treatments. But generally speaking, if you're identifying, if you have a corridor that has high volumes, in a 4-lane undivided or a 6-lane undivided configuration, then if you actually run that through something like, we have a crosswalk tool that takes all the information that is presented in the National Cooperative Highway Research Program, NCHOP 562, which is sort of the Bible that got incorporated into the latest version of their manual of uniform traffic control devices. But if you look at the sort of lookup tables, the float graphs at the back of that, and you identify what types of treatments are appropriate given the volume and speed of the cross-section you're looking at, you'll often come up with, on the 4-lane and 6-lane undivided, that it's not, you can't just put in two 12-inch white lines, you have to do more. And so it's important to look at the cost of that. But not only that, if you're going to do more, you're more than likely going to look at a couple of key crossing locations. So maybe you look at only enhancing one side of an intersection rather than both crosswalks at an intersection. Or maybe you only do every other intersection because you don't want to have these things repeating themselves too frequently due to the cost of it. So not only, if you actually did the road diet, not only would you not have to invest in those types of improvements, but you actually get a broader set of improvements. So if you did the road diet, you're improving every crossing. The one on the near side of the intersection, the one on the far side of the intersection that you might have skipped in the enhancements, the one in the middle that you might have skipped in the enhancements, all of the crosswalks are better as a result of the road diet project. So the more holistically you look at pedestrian circulation and the sort of more far-reaching you would, instead of improvements you would design around pedestrians to enhance their accessibility, the more the road diet makes sense.
Yeah, and I agree, and I think if we're going to cover in some of these future sessions, both the rectangular rapid flashing beacon and the pedestrian hybrid beacon in future sessions. So we can get a lot more detail then, but simply some of the criteria used to select locations for those treatments, the number of lanes. I mean, just by reducing that alone, I think you're eliminating the need to have to go to some of those higher cost treatments. Simply by doing the road diet and getting the number of lanes down, you're eliminating that multiple threat crash risk and really improving safety right there. So I think that that's a great point. It's not one that I've heard a lot in terms of a selling point for road diet. I think it's just an important one to consider if you're trying to balance those crossing improvements with some of your other needs on a corridor.
Yeah.
A question here. This is a bit more of a specific design question, I guess. When you're talking about these conversions and how to select your lane widths and things, what are you thinking about in terms of widths for your two-way left turn? Are you kind of working from the curb back in toward the middle, or are you selecting a certain two-way left turn lane width to optimize safety and turning volumes, and then kind of working back out toward the curb from there? How do you go about that process, and what should agencies consider when selecting that two-way left turn width?
Yeah, that's a good question. Really, it's probably done a little bit on a case-by-case basis. If it's a location where we are trying to put as much space as we can adjacent to the curbs, which is frequently what we're trying to do. If we're trying to either get corner bulbs and other enhancements or bike lane, then we will try to reduce the width of that two-way left turn lane, and that might convert it into left turn pockets at intersections. And we generally would go down as much as 10 foot in those instances. And that's another thing that there's, when I was talking about research around and acceptance around narrower travel lanes, most of that research was really related to through lanes. There's an even greater level of acceptance that, especially in left turn pockets, that you can go into even more narrow configurations, because when people enter those facilities, they are traveling more slowly because they're preparing to turn left. The exception to that would be in instances where you're trying to institute a continuous median along the length of the corridor, and you want to continue medians even at locations where you have turn pockets that signalize intersections. So if that's what you're trying to achieve, then in that case you might allocate the additional space or more space to the median, so that, say, you might be able to maintain a 14 or a 16-foot median throughout the length, but at the location where you had a turn pocket, you'd still have at least 4 feet and preferably 6 feet of a protected refuge island for pedestrians. So that would be our general rationale on or how we would think about where to allocate the space that you're gaining.
You touched on separated bike lanes. Some folks know them as cycle tracks, buffered bike lanes, those types of things in your presentation. Can you say a bit more about some of the considerations that you might need to think through before you add a cycle track into a road diet project, in terms of maybe the widths, but also maybe some of your considerations at intersections? Clearly, it's going to make things a bit more complex at those intersections, and something that agencies really want to think about, I'm sure.
Yeah, for sure. Let me back up just a second and talk a little bit about cycle tracks and buffered bike lanes and sort of why we're looking at doing those types of facilities more frequently now than we have in the past. I think there's a strong movement emerging around something called low-stress bikeways. The idea being that if we build bikeways that are, the other jargon is 8 to 80, that are more readily accessible to all users, people from the age of 8 all the way to the age of 80, that we will get more people riding. Part of that stream of consciousness thought process is that we have a relatively small percentage of cyclists or of our general population who are capable of, willing to tolerate what are relatively mean streets at present. And so that we really might get orders of magnitude, some say as many 10.5 times orders of magnitude more people riding if we built facilities that just had a low stress, that you would feel comfortable letting your child ride on unattended, and you would feel comfortable if your grandmother was riding on. So that's sort of the impetus behind building separated bikeways or cycle tracks. One of my concerns is really making sure that we use them appropriately, especially in suburban contexts where many of the cross streets are unsignalized. Providing somebody with a higher sense of comfort in the mid-block section where they're going to be behind a parked car and less likely to be struck by anybody pulling in or out, except if you have high-frequency driveways, which should be another consideration about whether you want in a cycle track. But if, providing somebody with a high degree of comfort in a mid-block section, only to expose them to a location at the intersection where maybe a vehicle does not expect to see them, especially on the two-way separated bikeways, the two directions of travel for cyclists on one side of the street. The idea that a vehicle who's turning right off of the arterial is not only looking behind them to see whether somebody's in the cycle track and knows that there's potentially somebody there, but also looking ahead of them to see if somebody's traveling the opposite direction of the cycle track in an unsignalized configuration is one that I would really like to see some additional research on whether that what the safety statistics are associated with that. So the ones that I'm the biggest fan of are the cycle tracks that are in New York City, where all the intersections are signalized, and all of the movements across the cycle track, the left and right, are phase separated. I have observed firsthand that many of the cyclists that use those facilities don't obey the signals, but I think that there's a higher propensity for the cyclists then to exercise more caution and making sure that if they're going to blow through the signals or travel the wrong direction on the bikeway, that they are looking out for others under the understanding that they don't have the right of way. So that's the context that I think cycle tracks are the most applicable. And then not that they're not applicable in the other settings, but it's that you just want to consider what are your turn volumes across the cycle track. What can you do to enhance the visibility of the cyclist? There's an interesting TRV research that I just saw from Peter Kuntz and others in Portland, looking at a flashing warning sign telling motorists when a cyclist is present. So it's actually an actuated flashing sign, letting the motorist know that a cyclist is in the cycle track. and they should yield the right turn right of way. So I just think it's an area that I would like to see more research. So that's my only caution about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's definitely an area of growing interest, and several questions did come in about cycle tracks. Though this wasn't specifically a cycle tracks focused webinar, I'd encourage you, if that's a topic you're interested in, to visit the FHWA website and check out their separated bike lane planning and design guide, which came out earlier here. There's a lot of good information there about considerations for those projects, and it certainly would be one that it would need to be, you need to consider all those factors for both road diets and for separated bike lanes, cycle tracks before you consider to do a project like that. But it is an area of growing interest, and so you're seeing a lot of questions about those topics. One final question I have here before we close out, Matthew, is we didn't get too much into talking about access management and those types of projects, but can you speak at all to the role of a road diet conversion being done as part of an access management project, and maybe some of the benefits of doing this all at the same time, or possibly chunking it out and kind of doing these in phased approaches, if you have any perspective on that?
Yeah, I have never done one as part of a formal access management plan. I certainly have done the road diet, especially where we had gas stations on corners. It wasn't necessarily intended to be an access management project, but as part of it, we went and, in one case, actually got a gas station to change because they had a conditional use permit application into the city, and so the city had some leverage to get them to change. In another case, just got it recorded as part of the project that if and when this gas station ever comes in for a change in its conditional use permit, that's the point at which you should eliminate one or more of the driveways, especially the ones closest to the intersection. So those, but I never worked on one that was truly sort of combined access management or road diet study. The only other thing I'll note, though, is that as part of several of the projects I've worked on that are residential road diets, where there's relatively frequent driveways, one of the benefits that we didn't anticipate, but that was reported in the after analysis that we've done is especially where we implemented bike lanes, was an easier time of getting in and out of their driveway. It's essentially saying that they felt more comfortable because they knew they had a little bit more buffer before they were blocking a travel lane. So not that they would necessarily only occupy the bike lane when they're pulling out, but they felt like they could see a little better once they got beyond. They were essentially pulling out far enough so they're maybe blocking the bike lane, but they're still, and it's better able to see whether there's a car in the remaining lane. So we have heard people say that it makes it easier to get in and out, particularly when you essentially replace the lane with bike lanes, which provides some buffer between the curb and the first moving lane.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, that I never thought the two are clearly related kinds of projects, but I was curious to hear your perspective, so I appreciate you sharing that. That's about all the time that we have today for questions. Matthew, thank you so much for fielding all of those, and Peter as well. A lot of good questions that came in, and I hope that the information that we shared on the webinar today was helpful to you, and hopefully it helps get you started with your road diet projects and answer some of those questions. I wanted to remind everybody that you will be receiving an email later today that will have a link to the archive page where we're going to be posting the video recording of this webinar. That page already has a PDF copy of the slide presentation from today, so if you didn't write everything down, every link or every note, feel free to obviously go back, check out that page, download those slides, and look through them again. The email is also going to have a link that you can use to generate a certificate of attendance for the webinar for today. So take that link, be sure to provide that to the others who are sitting with you in your office or your conference room who are attending the webinar with you, so that they can also produce a certificate of attendance for the webinar. I wanted to a very brief survey that will pop up on your screen. We would really appreciate your feedback and your comments on today's performance of today's webinar. We do have 10 more webinars that are going to be done as part of this series, so that anything we can do to improve the series or improve the presentations would be really beneficial to us if you would help us identify those areas of improvement. I'd encourage you also to consider, if you're interested in these topics and want to learn more, our next webinar will be happening next Thursday. It'll be on marked crosswalks. And so if that's a topic that interests you, I'd encourage you to go ahead and register, invite some of your friends to attend that webinar with you. Peter Unn and Charlie Zagier will be on to walk through that presentation next Thursday afternoon. So that's the next time we will be seeing us. I want to thank you all again for attending today's webinar, and thanks especially to Matthew Ridgeway for delivering today's presentation. I hope you all have a great day.